The result came back from the lab, and the scientist who had spent more than 2 decades studying bison genetics set down his instruments and refused to believe it. Not because the data was unclear, it was perfectly clear. Not because the equipment had malfunctioned. Everything had worked exactly as designed. He refused to believe it because what the genome sequencing had just revealed about the most celebrated, most protected, most scientifically trusted bison herd on the entire American continent was not supposed to be possible. For over 100 years, conservationists had treated these animals as something close to irreplaceable, the last honest copy, the cleanest surviving thread back to what the American bison was before the slaughter that nearly ended the species. And now a full genome test was saying that thread was not quite what anyone believed it to be. James Durr, a professor at Texas A&M University's College of Veterinary Medicine, later described the moment of seeing those results as being like getting punched in the mouth. He was, he said, in flat denial. He spent days trying to argue his way around the data before he finally accepted what it was telling him. What it told him changed the entire framework of bison conservation and forced every researcher working in this field to go back and recheck a history they thought had already been written. To understand why that result landed so hard, you have to understand what Yellowstone's bison actually meant to the scientific community before Durr's team ran that test. You have to go back to the moment the species came closest to disappearing entirely, because without that context, the numbers don't carry their full weight. In the middle of the 1800s, somewhere between 30 and 60 million bison covered the North American continent, a number so large it defies easy visualization. Herds stretched beyond the horizon in every direction. Their movement shaped the land. Their grazing decided which grasses lived and which died. Their hooves churned millions of acres of prairie soil into some of the most fertile ground on Earth. Entire cultures, economies, spiritual lives, and survival systems across the Great Plains were built directly around these animals. The bison was not a feature of that world. It was the foundation that the world was built on. Then within a single human lifetime, that world was almost completely erased. Commercial hunters moved through the plains and organized operations, stripping hides by the millions and shipping them east on rail cars. Passengers leaned out of train windows and shot animals for sport, leaving carcasses to rot in the sun. Underneath all of it ran a calculation that was never accidental. Military commanders understood that destroying the bison herds would break the Plains nations, who depended on them for everything. The killing was encouraged. It was sometimes deliberately organized. By the late 1880s, a species that had numbered in the tens of millions had been reduced to a documented count of 541 wild individuals remaining in the entire United States, from 60 million to 541, within the memory of people still alive at the time. Biologists have a specific term for a collapse this severe, a genetic bottleneck, a crash so extreme that an entire species is squeezed through a single narrow opening, carrying forward only whatever genetic variation happened to survive inside the few animals that made it through. This one eliminated well over 99% of the population. Every bison alive today, the roughly 500,000 animals spread across North America, traces its ancestry back to that tiny group of survivors. Whatever genetic material those few hundred animals carried in their blood is, quite literally, all the bison species had left to rebuild from. The most isolated survivors of all were the ones tucked away in the high mountain valleys of Yellowstone, the only place in the entire country where bison had lived continuously on the same landscape through the entire collapse without being removed, domesticated, or fenced away from the open land. Even there, they were not safe. By 1902, poachers were slipping into the park's backcountry to shoot the last wild bison for their mounted heads, which collectors paid more for than most working people earned in a year. When rangers finally counted what remained, the number stopped them cold. Approximately 23 animals, a number small enough to fit inside a single fenced pasture. An entire wild species, one of the defining animals of a continent, reduced to 23 living individuals in one high valley in Wyoming. Park officials understood immediately that a herd this small faced 2 kinds of extinction simultaneously. The obvious one from continued poaching, and a quieter, slower one from within, as inbreeding hollowed out the genetic diversity of the bloodline generation by generation until the animals simply could not survive the ordinary pressures of disease and environmental stress. They needed outside genetic material, and they needed it without delay. The decision they made in 1902 would shape the genetic future of the entire species, and its full consequences would not be understood for more than 100 years. The park purchased 21 bison from private herds operating across the continent at that time. 18 females came from a herd in Montana associated with the Pablo Allard operation, one of the most significant private conservation efforts in the history of the species. 3 bulls came from the Goodnight herd in Texas. These 21 animals were shipped into Yellowstone by rail and released into the Lamar Valley, where they could breed with the 23 surviving indigenous bison. The plan was sound and necessary, and it worked. The combined population grew. Within decades, the herd had expanded from those 44 founding animals into the thousands. That decision in 1902 is the single most important act in the survival of the American bison as a species. Without it, there would be no Yellowstone herd. Without the Yellowstone herd, the story of bison recovery in North America collapses. But history had quietly buried something inside those 21 rescue animals that nobody knew to look for until genome sequencing technology finally became powerful enough to reveal it. In the years following the great bison slaughter, ranchers across the West had been experimenting with something. During the severe beef shortages that followed the commercial hunting catastrophe, some ranchers attempted to cross domestic cattle with bison, hoping to produce a hardier hybrid that could survive brutal winters while still providing commercially useful meat. They gave the experiment a name, Catallo. The program largely failed. The hybrid animals rarely grew or bred in the ways their breeders hoped, and most ranchers abandoned the effort after years of disappointing results. But abandoning the program did not undo the breeding that had already occurred. Some of the crossbred animals simply stayed within the surrounding private herds, physically indistinguishable from the purebred animals around them, their mixed ancestry invisible to any examination technology available at the time. They mixed into the general population. They were sold alongside purebred animals. They traveled wherever the herds traveled, including, as it turned out, into the private herds that Yellowstone would later turn to for its rescue stock. The Pablo Allard herd in Montana, the source of those 18 females sent to Yellowstone in 1902, had itself been built partly from animals purchased from a rancher named Buffalo Jones in 1893. That purchase mixed genuinely wild purebred bison together with animals that had documented cattle-bison hybrid ancestry. The rescue effort and the contamination, to use the word loosely, were threaded together from the very beginning. Nobody knew this at the time. Nobody had the tools to know it. The eye could not distinguish a bison carrying a fraction of cattle ancestry from a bison carrying none. Blood typing technology of the era had no resolution fine enough to detect what was present. For 100 years after the rescue, the Yellowstone herd was built up, protected, fenced off from any possible outside contact, and celebrated as the gold standard of bison genetic purity on the entire continent. Researchers measured every other bison herd against it. Conservation organizations held it up as the closest surviving copy of what the pre-slaughter bison had been. Its purity was not just a talking point, it was the foundation of decades of management strategy, funding decisions, and breeding policy. James Dare and his team, including doctoral researcher Sam Stroop and collaborator Brian Davis, set out in 2022 to run a full genome analysis on bison from every major historical lineage they could access. The study compared those bison genomes against more than 1,800 domestic cattle genomes, hunting at the molecular level for tiny fragments of DNA that simply did not belong in a bison genome. The signatures of cattle ancestry buried so deep in the sequence that earlier testing methods had never been able to detect them. They expected to find those signatures in the herds with documented histories of crossbreeding, and they did. That part was no surprise. What genuinely stopped the team was where else those fragments appeared. Every single bison genome analyzed in the study carried identifiable regions of cattle DNA. Not most of them. All of them. The protected national park populations, the ones held up as untouched. Yellowstone, Elk Island National Park in Canada, populations that earlier genetic studies had specifically examined and declared free of cattle ancestry. The cattle signature was there in all of them, present in amounts tiny enough to have hidden beneath the resolution limit of every previous testing technology. The amounts were genuinely small. The Yellowstone individual with the lowest cattle ancestry came back at just 0.24%. Across more visibly mixed commercial herds, the figures ran between roughly 0.5% and just under 2.5%. To put those numbers in biological perspective, most people of European or Asian descent carry approximately 2% Neanderthal DNA in their own genomes, a fact that has not changed how we think about human identity or human continuity. In strict genetic terms, the purest wild bison alive is carrying less mixed ancestry than the average human being reading about it, but that context did not cushion the impact for Dare when the results first arrived. He had spent decades working within a field organized around the assumption that Yellowstone's animals were clean. The finding was not just a scientific surprise, it was a direct challenge to a century of received wisdom that the entire conservation community had built policy around. What Dare's research revealed when Stroop went back through the historical records was that the contamination, if it can even be called that, had never been the result of a lapse in protection or a stray animal wandering through a broken fence. It was embedded in the rescue itself. The people who pulled the bison back from the edge of total extinction in the late 1800s were, without any awareness of what they were doing, working with animals whose bloodlines already contained traces of cattle ancestry from the hybridization experiments of the era. With one hand, they hauled the species back from oblivion. With the other, they quietly rewired its genetic future forever. Both hands belonged to the same act. The rescue and what came with it were never two separate events. They were one event, documented in 1902, and fully understood only in 2022. The 2024 study published in the Journal of Heredity added another layer to this story. Sam Stroop, Jim Durr, and their colleagues completed a genetic reassessment of the Yellowstone population itself using tissue samples collected from 282 bison during 2019 and 2021. What they found was that after more than a century of existing as two genetically distinct subpopulations, the two ancestral threads running through Yellowstone had finally merged. The indigenous survivors of the bottleneck, the 23 animals that remained in 1902, and the descendants of the 21 outsiders brought in that same year, had been tracked as separate lineages for over 100 years. The maternal DNA passed down through generations kept their origins readable, but the 2024 analysis showed that in the past 2 decades, those two threads had at last woven together completely into a single interbreeding population. 2 lines of bison that began the 20th century as separate groups are now, genetically speaking, one herd. The family tree that took a century to grow had finally closed into a single continuous canopy. The reaction within the bison conservation world when Durr's 2022 findings became widely known was immediate and divided. Some researchers and herd managers with deep investments in the concept of genetic purity took the news hard. Others argued that purity had been the wrong lens from the start. Geneticist Oliver Ryder noted that the concept of purity is a human invention imposed on a biological process that is naturally messy, constantly blending, and never as clean in practice as the idealized version humans prefer to imagine. Brian Davis made a similar case. Hybridization, he pointed out, is not a shameful accident in evolutionary history. It is one of the most ordinary tools through which species adapt and survive. The history of life on Earth is a history of mixing, not of rigid separation. Seen in that light, the tiny trace of cattle ancestry in Yellowstone bison is not contamination. It is ancestry, a genetic record of exactly how the species survived the narrowest moment in its history, preserved in molecules at the center of every cell. And if purity was never entirely real, then the walls built to protect it can start coming down in productive ways. For decades, conservation managers kept bison herds strictly isolated from one another, terrified that mixing would corrupt bloodlines that were imagined to be pristine. If the pristine ideal was never fully accurate, then herds previously held apart can now be deliberately combined to build larger, more genetically diverse, more resilient populations. That shift is already visible in the decisions being made on the ground in 2025 and 2026. In February 2026, the Bison Conservation Transfer Program completed what was described as the largest single bison transfer in the program's entire history. 213 Yellowstone bison made a 470-mile journey across Montana to the Fort Peck Indian Reservation, where the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes now manage nearly 1,000 buffalo across tens of thousands of acres of restored grassland. The transfer happened on February 19, 2026, in minus 13-degree weather. More than a dozen people stood around a large corral in the frozen air as the animals unloaded from transport trucks onto their new land. Members of the Fort Peck tribe's Pete group were present to welcome the animals. A fire burned nearby. People gathered close, watching, honoring a moment that represented something far larger than a logistics operation. Fort Peck's quarantine facility operates on 320 acres with 4 separate pens, follows federal and state disease testing protocols rigorously, and holds incoming animals for a full year before they join the main herd. Robbie Magnin, who has directed the tribe's buffalo program for years, describes Fort Peck's animals as the most tested bison in the world. Throughout the entire history of the program, not one animal in Fort Peck's quarantine has returned a positive test for brucellosis, a fact worth noting because for decades, the disease argument was the primary justification for keeping Yellowstone bison from leaving the park in significant numbers. Despite years of caution built around that concern, there has never been a single documented case of a wild Yellowstone bison transmitting brucellosis to cattle. Every confirmed transmission in the historical record has come from elk. The bison were contained based on a threat that the data, when examined carefully, did not support in the way the policy assumed. Magnin has said publicly that he did not grow up around buffalo. He was 10 years old before he saw one in a zoo, hundreds of miles from his home, because the animal had been absent from Fort Peck for 2 complete generations before his time. Now he oversees a herd approaching 1,000 animals on the same land his grandparents knew only through stories. The reversal is one he has described as something he never expected to witness in his own lifetime. Since the transfer program began in 2019, more than 294 bison have been moved from Yellowstone to Fort Peck, and approximately 170 of those have been further distributed to 23 tribes across 12 states in partnership with the Intertribal Buffalo Council. The pace of those transfers has accelerated every year as the quarantine pipeline has grown more efficient and more tribal facilities have come online to receive animals. Inside Yellowstone itself, the park has also quietly abandoned a long-standing population cap. For years, the herd was managed toward a ceiling of roughly 3,000 animals. That cap has been replaced by a new target range, allowing the population to grow between approximately 3,500 and 6,000. A deliberate decision to let the herd expand rather than hold it artificially small out of a precaution that the genetic evidence now suggests was built on an incomplete picture of what these animals actually are and where they actually came from. The bison in Yellowstone today number approximately 5,400 animals. They roam the park as a single herd, no longer separable in the field into their founding lineages, though the two ancestral threads that built the population remain readable in their genomes for anyone who knows how to look. The last truly wild bison on Earth, the ones scientists once held up as the gold standard of untouched genetic heritage, carry inside their cells a faint signature of cattle ancestry placed there by the very act of saving the species. The rescue and the complication arrive together and cannot be separated. Without the private herds that brought those 21 animals to Yellowstone in 1902, there would be no herd to study or debate. Without the ranchers who had spent years working with mixed animals before anyone understood the consequences, the species would likely have disappeared entirely. The people who saved the bison and the people who unknowingly mixed their bloodlines were, in most cases, the same people doing both things simultaneously. What Dare's genome work ultimately gave the scientific community was not a scandal. It was clarity. It told a more honest version of a story that had been simplified for a century into something cleaner than the biological reality ever was. The purity that conservation policy was built around was real in every meaningful practical sense and statistically marginal in the genomic sense. The animals are bison. They behave as bison. They fill the ecological role of bison. The faint trace of cattle DNA running through their cells does not change what they are in any way that matters to the grasslands they restore or the cultural and ecological meaning they carry for the tribal nations who have spent decades working to bring them home. In 2016, more than a century after the first private individuals quietly began preserving animals that everyone else was allowing to be destroyed, the United States formally named the bison the national mammal, a symbolic recognition of a recovery that nearly did not happen, carried out by people whose names were largely never recorded and whose contributions were only beginning to be properly understood when genomics finally gave scientists the tools to read the full story embedded in the animals themselves. The DNA inside a Yellowstone bison is not a simple record. It is a complicated one, layered with decisions made by people long dead, consequences they could not foresee, rescues that carried unexpected complications, and a species that survived all of it. 23 survivors, 21 outsiders, one genome that still remembers everything that happened to get here, written in molecules too small to see and too precise to misread.